"They're not barking, Captain. They're calling for someone who isn't coming back." Warrant Officer Ray Tessier had to shout to be heard over the hellish racket pouring out of the kennel block, and even then his words barely cut through. The noise was something primal, a rolling thunder of deep-chested barks layered over high, frantic howls, and the grinding screech of claws raking concrete. It wasn't the sound of animals misbehaving. It was the sound of something breaking apart from the inside out. Captain Nolan Birch stood 3 meters from the chain-link runs, his jaw set, a ruggedized laptop balanced on one forearm. On the screen, colored graphs charted bite risk indices, cortisol trend estimates, and a behavioral modification timeline that stretched optimistically into next quarter. He was 29 years old, held a master's in applied behavioral science from RMC, and had been posted to CFB Petawawa's military working dog section exactly 11 weeks ago with a mandate from Ottawa to fix things or shut them down. So far, fixing things was not going well. 7 runs, 7 dogs, each one a decorated veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, dogs that had walked point through Kandahar province, swept vehicles at diplomatic summits, and guarded high-value detainees at locations that still didn't appear on any official map. Belgian Malinois, Dutch Shepherds, German Shepherds, the elite of the elite. They had served with distinction. They had earned their rest. Instead, they were destroying themselves. "Warrant, I understand the emotional angle," Birch said, not looking up from his screen. "But emotion doesn't generate solutions. What I see here are 7 high-drive animals exhibiting chronic stress responses consistent with handler loss syndrome. The literature is clear on treatment protocols." Tessier, a barrel-chested man with 22 years in the military police and a face that looked like it had been carved from Laurentian granite, said nothing for a moment. He just watched the dogs. He knew each one by name, by history, by the specific way they tilted their heads when they heard a familiar footfall. He had been there when most of them were green pups shipped up from Lackland, all paws and teeth and boundless want to please. "Literature," Tessier repeated, the word flat in his mouth. "Sir, with respect, Phantom lost his handler to a medical release after 9 years together. Blitz's handler was killed in a training accident at Wainwright last spring. Every single one of these dogs had their world ripped away. They're not data points. They're grieving. And if we can't get them stable enough for adoption or rehoming in the next 60 days, NDHQ is recommending disposal." Birch let the words sit there. Disposal. The bureaucratic way of saying that 7 of the most capable, most loyal soldiers the Canadian forces had ever produced would be put down because peacetime had no use for their broken hearts. Tessier's hands tightened into fists at his sides. He'd heard the rumor. Hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. Inside the nearest run, a big sable Dutch shepherd named Phantom was throwing himself against the gate in a rhythmic, almost mechanical cycle. Slam paws, slam paws. His muzzle was raw from it. Next to him, a dark-coated Malinois called Sable stood rigid in the far corner of her run, her entire body vibrating with a low, ceaseless growl that never rose and never fell, just an endless engine of contained fury. There was Blitz, a massive German shepherd who lay in the dead center of his run, head on his paws, eyes open and staring at nothing, so still he might have been carved from stone, except for the occasional shudder that ran through his body like a current. The remaining 4, Jinx, Kodiak, Raptor, and Nix, were in various states of frantic pacing, stress panting, and explosive barking that made the younger handlers flinch every time they had to approach the feeding hatches. 2 privates had already put in transfer requests. A corporal had been bitten through a Kevlar glove last Thursday. Things were getting dangerous, and dangerous meant the clock was ticking faster. "My revised protocol calls for," Birch started, but Tessier held up a hand. The warrant officer's head was cocked, his brow furrowed. Something had changed. It took Birch a second to register it. The noise hadn't stopped. It had shifted. The individual chaos of 7 dogs screaming their separate agonies had suddenly fused into a single, focused wall of sound directed at one point. Every animal was pressed against the front of their run. Every head oriented in exactly the same direction, every bark now sharp, staccato, purposeful. Both men turned. An old man was walking up the service lane that ran along the backside of the kennel block. He moved slowly, not with frailty, but with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned a long time ago that rushing was a waste of energy. He wore a faded canvas jacket the color of dried tobacco, work trousers tucked into scuffed leather boots, and a shapeless wool cap pulled down against the late October chill. In his left hand he carried a wooden crate, and even from this distance, Birch could see the gold amber gleam of glass jars inside it. Honey. There was a small apiary operation south of the base, some local who sold wildflower honey to the mess kitchens. Birch had signed the purchase order himself without much thought. The old man looked like exactly what he appeared to be, a beekeeper making a delivery. Ordinary. Forgettable. He was also inside a restricted perimeter, and he was walking directly toward the most dangerous animals on the base. "Sir," Birch called out, his voice snapping into command register, "you're in a controlled area. Stop where you are." The old man didn't stop. He didn't even look over. His eyes, half hidden beneath the brim of his cap, were fixed on the fence line, tracking along the row of runs with the slow, sweeping attention of someone reading a landscape. And then everything went quiet. It didn't fade. It didn't taper. It stopped. One heartbeat, the air was being shredded by 7 voices screaming in unison. The next, there was nothing but the October wind moving through the birch trees along the tree line and the faint, distant thrum of a Chinook warming up on the flight line. 7 dogs. Silent still. They weren't cowering. They weren't ignoring the man. They were locked on, every ear forward, every body rigid with a kind of electric anticipation that Tessier had only ever seen one other time in his career. The instant before a handler gave a deployment command. They were waiting. The old man stopped. He set the crate of honey down on the gravel with a soft, careful motion, then straightened and turned his full attention to the dogs. Phantom, the self-destructing Dutch shepherd, was pressed against the chain link. His tail, which hadn't wagged in weeks, gave a single slow sweep. Sable's growl had died. She was sitting now, head high, ears pricked so far forward they nearly touched, a thin whimper leaking from her throat. Even Blitz had lifted his head off his paws, his dark eyes focused with an intensity that hadn't been there minutes ago. Captain Birch strode toward the old man, his hand reflexively brushing the sidearm on his belt. "Sir, I need to see your identification. You're not authorized to be in this area." The beekeeper finally looked at him. His face was weathered to the color of old cedar, seamed with deep lines that mapped decades of sun and wind and cold. His eyes were gray-blue, pale as winter sky over Georgian Bay, and they held a quality that stopped Birch mid-stride. Not hostility, not defiance, but a calm so total it felt like standing next to a lake at dawn before anything has disturbed the surface. He looked at Birch, then back at the dogs, and in a voice that was barely above a whisper but carried with unnatural clarity in the frozen silence, he said a single word: "Platz." The German command hit the air like a tuning fork. All 7 dogs dropped simultaneously into a perfect downstay. Paws tucked, chins up, eyes locked forward on an invisible vanishing point. The precision was absolute, military, drilled into muscle and nerve over thousands of hours of training that had been buried under months of grief and rage and confusion. One word from a stranger, and it all came roaring back like water through a broken dam. Birch stopped breathing. Tessier felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. He had worked with MWDs for over 2 decades. He had seen the bond between handler and dog perform miracles, but that bond was specific, singular, built over years of shared hardship. One man commanding 7 dogs, none of them his, with a single word. It violated everything he understood about the craft. The old man looked back at Birch with something that might have been patience, might have been pity. "They're not broken, Captain," he said. "They're just waiting for someone who speaks their language." He turned to Tessier, and a faint current of recognition passed between them, the kind that doesn't come from having met before, but from having lived in the same hidden world. "They need a mission," the beekeeper added quietly, almost to himself. "A dog without work is a soldier without a war. It'll eat itself alive." Tessier found his voice, though it came out rough. "Who are you?" The old man offered a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Murray Calder. I keep bees about 12 clicks south of here, off Highway 17. Your mess sergeant ordered 6 dozen jars of buckwheat honey." He nudged the wooden crate with the toe of his boot as if that explained everything. But Tessier was looking at the man's hands. They rested on the top rail of the fence now, relaxed, easy. They were a beekeeper's hands, sure, thickened skin, a faint map of old stings across the knuckles. But Tessier saw other things. He saw the pale, ropey scars wrapping the inside of both wrists and across the palms, the kind you got from thousands of hours gripping a braided leather leash while a 70-pound dog lunged at the end of it. He saw the slightly deformed middle finger on the right hand, bent at a permanent angle that came from one specific repetitive motion, throwing a bite sleeve. Those were not a beekeeper's hands. Those were a handler's hands, and not just any handler. "How did you do that?" Birch demanded. The raw edge in his voice was something new. His entire framework, the charts, the protocols, the clean logic of behavioral science, had just been dismantled by an old man in a wool cap. That command, Platts, any handler could give it. "They don't respond to our handlers. They don't respond to anyone." Calder looked back at the dogs, still holding their perfect, eerie discipline. "It's not the word," he said. "You could say it in Cree, and it would work. It's everything underneath. The way you carry your weight, the way you breathe. Dogs don't listen to language. They listen to intention. Right now, every person who walks up to these runs is broadcasting fear, frustration, uncertainty. So the dogs give you what you're projecting. Chaos," he paused. "You give them calm, you get calm back. It's not complicated. It's just hard." He moved to Phantom's run and stood before it, his posture shifting in a way that was almost imperceptible but profoundly significant. His shoulders dropped, his center of gravity lowered. He wasn't standing at the fence. He was rooting into the ground, becoming as immovable and unremarkable as a fence post. He began to speak to the Dutch shepherd in a low, continuous murmur, not commands, not praise, just a quiet, rhythmic cadence that rose and fell like breathing. A conversation between equals. Phantom, the dog who had been slamming himself into his gate for weeks, crawled forward on his belly and pressed his nose against the chain link. A high, keening whine escaped him, the sound of something locked up for too long finally finding a crack to seep through. Calder knelt, slowly, his knees popping audibly in the cold air, and lowered his forehead until it almost touched the fence. He closed his eyes, he breathed. The dog breathed with him. Tessier watched with his arms folded across his chest and his throat tight. He was seeing something he couldn't name, something older than any training manual. It was the restoration of trust, offered freely without demand or condition. Calder wasn't asserting dominance, he was offering presence. After 2 full minutes, Calder rose and unlatched the gate. Phantom didn't bolt. He waited. Calder gave a soft chirp, barely audible, and the Dutch shepherd walked out calmly and sat at the man's left side, pressing his shoulder into Calder's thigh. One down. He moved to Sable. With her, his approach was different, slower, more respectful. He stood at an angle, not facing her directly, and his murmur took on a different quality, something acknowledging, almost apologetic. When he opened her gate, she didn't sit. She leaned her entire body into him, her flank pressed against his legs, and exhaled a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry the weight of months. He steadied her with one hand on her withers, his fingers finding the tight knots of muscle there and working them loose with an absent, practiced touch. With Blitz, the silent one, the dog who had simply shut down, Calder didn't speak at all. He stood before the run in absolute stillness, matching the dog's own frozen quiet. A minute passed, 2. Then Blitz sighed. A deep whole-body exhalation, rose to his feet and walked out through the open gate. He took a position slightly behind Calder, his big head swinging in slow arcs, scanning the perimeter. Still a soldier, still on watch. One by one, the old man worked down the line. Jinx, a compact, wire-tight Malinois with a bite record that had made her virtually unapproachable, came out last. With her, Calder spent the longest time, his voice dropping to something barely above a breath. When she finally emerged, she walked into tight circle around him once, then sat facing outward, her back to his legs, guarding him. 15 minutes. 7 dogs. Not a single raised voice, not a single correction, not a single treat. They stood in a loose, disciplined arc around Murray Calder in the exercise yard, 7 of the most dangerous and most broken animals in the Canadian Forces inventory, arranged around a 68-year-old beekeeper, like an honor guard forming around a general. Captain Birch had closed his laptop at some point. He couldn't remember when. He was watching a man operate in a dimension he hadn't known existed. Everything he'd studied, every model, every framework, it all felt suddenly like trying to understand music by reading sheet metal. "Open the main yard," Birch said. Tessier was already moving. He unlocked the double gate, the heavy steel groaning open, and stepped aside. Calder walked through with 7 dogs held on nothing. No leashes, no commands, just the invisible thread of his presence, and they followed him like water following a current. In the open yard, Calder stopped and finally turned to face the 2 men directly. "Who walks them?" he asked. Birch hesitated. "No one. They can't be walked. That's the problem." Calder's voice was gentle, but the finality in it left no room. "They're patrol dogs, detection dogs, protection dogs. Their entire identity is built on movement, on purpose, on going somewhere with someone. You've locked them in boxes and wondered why they're going mad. He paused. Do you have leashes? Standard 6-foot leads? Tessier disappeared into the equipment shed and returned with an armful of military-issue nylon leads. Calder examined them, then shook his head. He walked back to the service lane, picked up his honey crate, and from beneath the jars pulled out a cloth bundle. Inside were 7 leather leashes, old and supple, the brass hardware darkened with age. They weren't military issue. They were something else, handmade, the stitching tight, and even, the leather worn to the color of dark walnut by years of use. Where did those come from? Tessier asked. Calder didn't answer directly. He began leashing the dogs, and Birch watched his hands work with the kind of fluid, unconscious precision that only came from doing something 10,000 times. He didn't just clip the leash to the collar. He ran his fingers along each dog's neck, checking the fit, feeling for tension, adjusting. His hands spoke a language his mouth didn't need to. 7 leashes gathered in his left hand. 7 elite military working dogs, any one of which could pull a grown man off his feet and drag him across gravel, walked in a calm, even formation beside a man who looked like he should be sitting in a rocking chair on a porch somewhere north of Bancroft. Then Calder turned to Birch. Your turn, Captain. Birch took an involuntary step back. I'm not a handler. I've never. Take Sable. She was protection detail. She'll walk at your right, half a step behind. Your job is to walk like you know where you're going. She'll decide if you're worth following. Birch entered the yard the way a man enters cold water. Calder placed the leash in his hand, didn't hand it, placed it, then adjusted his grip, folding his fingers around the leather with a specificity that bordered on surgical. Don't grip. Don't pull. The leash isn't a restraint. It's a telephone line. You talk through it. She talks back. Feel the weight of her at the other end. That's a living thing telling you she's here. Birch walked. His first steps were stiff, mechanical, his whole body rigid with the effort of not looking terrified. Sable moved beside him with a fluid, watchful grace, her intelligent eyes flicking up to read his face, his posture, his breathing. He could feel the leash hum with a faint, steady tension, not pulling, not slack, just there, present, connected. He walked to the far fence and back. When he returned, something in his face had changed. The analytical distance, the administrative remove, it had cracked, and through the crack, something raw and real was seeping in. He had felt the dog's trust, offered provisionally, conditionally, and it had undone something in him he hadn't known was wound tight. Better, Calder said. Just that. He handed a leash to Tessier. Then he beckoned to 2 young privates who had been watching from the doorway of the kennel office with expressions that sat somewhere between amazement and religious conversion. He gave each of them a dog, offering quiet, specific instructions. Jinx will test you. She'll bump your leg. Try to get ahead. Don't fight her. Just slow down. She'll match you. She's looking for a partner, not a boss. And to the other, Kodiak scans high, rooftops, tree lines. Let him. He was urban overwatch. Give him something to watch, and he's happy. Within minutes, 4 people were walking 4 dogs around the yard in slow, measured circuits. The scene was almost absurdly peaceful. The late autumn sun slanting through the birch trees, the dogs moving with the relaxed alertness of professionals who had finally been given something to do, the handlers walking with a tentative, growing confidence that straightened their spines and steadied their hands. Calder stood in the center with the remaining 3 dogs, watching. His expression was unreadable, but Tessier caught something moving behind those pale eyes, a deep, weary satisfaction, the look of a man watching a wrong being quietly put right. After 20 minutes, Calder called them in. The dogs were returned to their runs without a sound of protest. They walked in willingly, lay down, and watched the old man with soft, steady eyes. The silence that settled over the kennel block was the kind of silence that comes after a long storm, not an absence of sound but a presence of peace. Calder latched the last gate and turned to face the small group. They don't need a new protocol, Captain, he said, his gaze settling on Birch. They need a job. Walk them twice a day. Groom them every morning, same person, same time. Run detection exercises in the yard. Doesn't matter what they're finding, just that they're finding something. They're working dogs. Give them work, and the grief has somewhere to go instead of turning inward. He picked up his honey crate. Feed the buckwheat honey to the mess. It's good for sore throats. Cold season's coming. He started walking back toward the service lane, his shoulders settling into a familiar, unhurried curve. Mr. Calder! Tessier's voice stopped him. The warrant officer walked up to the old man, his expression a complicated map of gratitude and the kind of burning curiosity that wouldn't let go. I've been in the MWD world for 22 years. Handlers from every branch, every NATO partner, Americans, Brits, Dutch. I've never seen what you just did. That wasn't handling. That was something I don't have a word for. Calder looked at the ground for a moment. When he raised his eyes, there was a flicker of something vulnerable in them, quickly covered. The best handlers learn early that the leash runs both ways, he said. The dog holds you together just as much as you hold him. I had dogs who kept me sane for 30 years. I owe them more than I can ever pay back. This is just interest on the debt, 30 years, Birch said, stepping forward. He had his phone in his hand. I ran your name while you were in the yard. Murray Calder. There's nothing. No service record, no handler qualification, no CPAS file. According to Duan, you don't exist in any military database. Calder's faint smile returned, a thing made mostly of sadness. Not every record makes it into a database, Captain. Some things are kept in filing cabinets in buildings that don't have signs on the door. Some things aren't kept at all. Tessier spoke carefully, the way a man speaks when he's not sure he should be speaking at all. When I was a young corporal at the Kennels in Edmonton, there were stories. Old warrant officers who'd been around since the Cold War. They talked about a unit that ran dogs behind the Iron Curtain. East Germany, Czechoslovakia, sometimes further. JTF-2 before JTF-2 existed, except these ones worked with dogs. No insignia, no unit patches. They called them the quiet handlers. The story was, they could communicate with their dogs without making a sound. That the bond was different. The October wind picked up, sending a scatter of yellow birch leaves across the gravel. Murray Calder's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a door opening briefly onto a long hallway of rooms he had closed off decades ago. They were good dogs, he said, his voice quiet and far away. The best I ever knew. They deserved better than to be classified. He didn't confirm, he didn't deny. He picked up his honey crate and walked away down the service lane, his boots crunching softly on the gravel, his pace unhurried, his back straight despite the years. He didn't look behind him. Birch and Tessier watched him go until he was a small figure against the tree line, and then he rounded the bend in the road and was gone, as if the landscape had simply reabsorbed him. They turned and looked at the kennel block. The silence held. Through the chain link, 7 warriors lay in pools of October sunlight, their breathing slow and even, their eyes soft, their bodies finally, mercifully still. The next morning, Captain Nolan Birch arrived at the kennels 40 minutes before first light. He wasn't carrying his laptop. In one hand he held a grooming kit, a stiff bristle brush, a steel comb, a chamois cloth, purchased the previous evening from a pet supply store in Pembroke. In the other he carried one of the old leather leashes. He had kept them all. He didn't go to his office. He walked directly to Sable's Run. The Malinois, who 48 hours ago would have met his approach with a sustained, teeth-baring snarl that had made experienced handlers back away, was sitting at the front of her run watching him come. Her tail moved, not the frantic, anxious whip of a stressed dog, but a slow, measured sweep. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a door being held open. Birch took a breath. He tried to find the stillness he had seen in Murray Calder, that absolute, grounded calm that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training. He tried to quiet the part of his brain that wanted to quantify, to categorize, to control. He just tried to be there. He unlatched the gate. Sable, come. She came. She walked out and sat at his side, her shoulder against his leg, and the warmth of her through his uniform trousers was the most real thing he had felt in years. For the next hour, while the sky turned from black to gray to the pale rose gold of a Canadian autumn dawn, he groomed her. His hands were clumsy at first, too much pressure with the brush, too hesitant with the comb around her ears. But he listened with his hands the way Calder had told him to, and gradually, the dog's breathing slowed and deepened, and his hands found their rhythm. Tessier arrived at 0630 and found him there, cross-legged on the concrete floor of the exercise yard, running the chamois over Sable's coat while the dog lay with her head in his lap, her eyes half closed. The 2 young privates from the day before were already at work in the kennel block, cleaning runs and talking to the dogs in low, steady voices. The fear that had haunted the place for months was gone, replaced by something careful and deliberate and new. Tessier leaned against the fence, a thermos of coffee in his hand. I pulled every string I have, he said. Called retired Kios, old contacts at Kansofcom, even a buddy at the Privy Council who owes me. Murray Calder doesn't exist in any system. No service number, no pension file. Nothing. Maybe that's the point, Birch said, not looking up. He was watching his own hands move across the dog's flank, feeling the slow, powerful rhythm of her breathing, and understanding for the first time that leadership wasn't something you imposed. It was something you offered. Maybe some people serve in places where existing on paper is the one thing you can't afford to do. Tessier nodded slowly, took a sip of coffee. He gave you the key, sir, the warrant officer said, but you're the one turning it. A week later, a parcel arrived at the kennel office. It was a plain cardboard box, no return address, postmarked from a rural route near Calabogie, Ontario. Inside, wrapped in brown butcher paper, was a stack of books, not military training manuals, books on wolves, on pack dynamics, on the evolution of the bond between canids and humans across 10,000 years of shared history. Tucked into the front cover of the top book was a photograph. It was black and white, faded at the edges, printed on the heavy matte paper of a different era. A younger Murray Calder, lean, hard-jawed, in a field jacket stripped of all insignia, knelt beside a big German shepherd on what looked like a forest trail somewhere in northern Europe. The trees were dense conifers, the light was gray and flat, and both man and dog were looking at the camera with the same expression. Alert, watchful, ready. There was snow on the ground. The dog's eyes caught the light. The man's hand rested on the dog's collar with the casual intimacy of a shared language that needed no words. On the back of the photograph, written in a precise, unhurried hand, were 4 words, "It runs both ways." Birch framed the photograph. He hung it on the wall of the kennel office, in the exact spot where his behavioral analytics charts used to be displayed. It became a different kind of metric, one that couldn't be graphed or scheduled or optimized, but that worked. Over the following weeks, Birch and Tessier rebuilt the program from the ground up. Every morning began with grooming, every dog assigned to the same handler, same time, same routine. Twice daily patrols along the base perimeter gave the dogs movement and purpose. Tessier set up scent detection lanes in the exercise yard using decommissioned training aids. Old RCMP evidence bags, spent ammunition casings, the kinds of things that triggered the dog's deepest training without any actual operational risk. They weren't just being exercised, they were working, and the work was healing them. The change was profound and steady. The aggression didn't disappear overnight, but it receded like a tide, revealing underneath it the disciplined, loyal, deeply intelligent animals these dogs had always been. Phantom stopped throwing himself at his gate. Sable's growl became a distant memory. Blitz lifted his head and began scanning his surroundings again with the quiet competence of a professional who had found his footing. The young handlers changed too. The privates who had been afraid to fill water bowls 8 weeks ago were now leading detection exercises with a quiet confidence that came from the same source Calder had tapped. Not dominance, not control, but trust. They were learning the handler's language, the one spoken through posture and breath, and the steady tension of a leather leash. Months passed. The story of the beekeeper who had walked out of the October woods and silenced 7 screaming dogs with a single word became the foundational legend of the kennel block. The story Tessier told every new handler who came through. The 7 dogs, once 60 days from being destroyed, became the heart of the unit. They became teachers. The young handlers working with the new generation of MWDs would watch how Birch and Tessier handled the old veterans, absorbing the subtleties of a craft that no textbook could fully capture. Birch himself was barely recognizable as the data-obsessed captain who had arrived 11 weeks earlier with his laptop and his charts and his absolute faith in measurable outcomes. He still collected data, old habits die hard, but he understood now that the numbers were a shadow cast by something they couldn't measure. The real work happened in the space between a handler's hand and a dog's shoulder, in the quality of a breath, in the steadiness of a gaze. One afternoon in late January, a black staff car pulled up to the kennel block. A full colonel from the Canadian Joint Operations Command stepped out, his breath clouding in the -20 air. He had come to see the miracle dogs, the ones whose turnaround had been generating quiet but persistent buzz up the chain of command. Birch met him at the gate and led him to the exercise yard. The 7 dogs were there, working a search pattern with 3 handlers, moving through the cold with focused, purposeful energy. Their coats gleamed. Their movements were precise and willing. They looked like what they were, professionals doing a job they were born to do. The colonel, a man who had seen enough in 30 years of service to be difficult to impress, watched them for a long time without speaking. Last briefing I saw on this section recommended termination of the program and disposal of all animals, the colonel said, his voice neutral. What changed? Birch looked at the dogs, then at the framed photograph on the wall of his office, visible through the frosted window. He thought about the quiet old man with the honey crate and the beekeeper's jacket, and the hands that told a story no database would ever hold. He could have given the colonel the clean answer, the one that fit neatly into a briefing slide: revised protocols, enrichment programming, evidence-based intervention. It was the kind of answer that made sense in a report, but it wouldn't have been true. We changed, sir, Birch said. We stopped trying to manage them and started trying to understand them. We learned to listen. The colonel studied him for a moment, then nodded once. Whatever you're doing, Captain, keep doing it. This isn't just about dogs. You're building better soldiers. That evening, after the colonel's car had disappeared down the base road, Birch took Blitz for a final walk along the perimeter. The German shepherd moved through the deep snow with a quiet, steady power, his breath pluming white in the Arctic air, his senses still sharp, still reading the world around them with the attentive focus of a veteran who might be retired but would never truly stand down. They stopped on the small rise overlooking the base, the lights of Petawawa glowing soft and orange against the snow-covered Ottawa Valley. Birch knelt and buried his hands in the thick ruff of Blitz's neck, feeling the dog's heartbeat steady and strong beneath his fingers. The cold bit at his face, but the warmth of the dog against his legs was enough. He thought about Murray Calder, the quiet handler who had materialized from a gravel road and a crate of buckwheat honey, who had spoken a single word and stopped time, who had read 7 dogs' souls without consulting a single file, and who had vanished back into the Ontario countryside, carrying nothing but an empty honey crate and a lifetime of classified silence. Birch looked down at his own hands. They were rougher now, nicked and calloused from months of leash work and kennel maintenance and grooming. They were no longer the soft, clean hands of an administrator. They were becoming something else. They were learning the language. He hadn't just saved 7 dogs. Murray Calder and these 7 dogs had saved him. They had given him a purpose that no performance metric could capture, a mission measured not in data points but in the slow, steady rhythm of a dog's breathing and the quiet weight of trust at the end of a leather leash, and in the vast, cold silence of a Canadian winter night, with Blitz warmth pressed against him and the stars hard and bright above the valley, Captain Nolan Birch finally understood. The leash ran both ways. It always had.